as people probably are filtering back in and getting their coffees and so on, I think we will launch our final event of the day. And that is our panel discussion, which is the theme is new ways into English. And I think it came about simply because there's such a fascinating moment that we're in terms of all kinds of new technologies and also AI and the possibilities as well as the worries about that. But also, as we saw this morning with Roz's talk, which involved visualization of data and Adam's thinking about the circulation of texts and so on. So there's a lot going on, and we thought we'd try to gather some thoughts on this from our panel of experts. And I'm going to introduce them. And as usual, I think it would be wonderful if people could put any questions they have into the Q&A chat panel, not the regular chat panel because we might miss it, but the Q&A button, which is to the right of the green share button on your screen. And just to say, the format will be that we'll have the panelists all speaking for 5 minutes each, roughly, and then we'll open it up for questions from you all. So I thought I would start by introducing everybody. So Gary Snupper is in the Department of Education at Oxford, and Gary is a lecturer in education and was previously head of English at a comprehensive school in Cambridge and the editor of you'll have to remind me with the acronym, NATE's.
NATE, National Association for the Teaching of English.
Teaches the English magazine, which is called Teaching English. And Phoebe Mortimer is from Cheney School here in Oxford. And Phoebe is an English teacher and sustainability lead who has developed an expertise in integrating sustainability into the secondary school English literature curriculum, delivering CPD sessions for English PGCE students, and contributing to the UCL Center for Climate Change Education Resources for English Teaching. She has a particular interest in framing and communication around the climate and nature crisis. Matt Simpson is from Wellsway School, which is just outside Bristol. And Matt is an English and film studies teacher and head of Key Stage 5 English at a comprehensive school in Bristol, which I just mentioned. He completed his master's in education at the University of Cambridge, researching how queer theory could be incorporated into the Key Stage 3 and 4 English curriculum, and he's written for NATE on the subject. All these acronyms. Let's see if I can get through the next one without them. Stefano Evangelista is professor of English and comparative literature at Oxford University. His research interests include the relationship between literature and visual culture, the reception of the classics, and the international connections of English literature. He's currently working on a 3-year project on literary cosmopolitanism in Berlin, funded by the Einstein Foundation. So they're all going to be speaking one after the other, and then we'll open it up to questions. So I think, Gary, you're going to set the stage for us. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, I'm going to try and share my slides. So if you could let me know whether you can see those okay.
Yep, that's looking good. It's coming. I think it's coming. Yes.
Is that okay?
You just want to go on.
Great.
Yeah, go on slideshow.
Oh, is that okay? Can you see the slideshow now?
Yeah, I think you want to. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Great.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to attempt a overview, a sort of introduction to what's going to follow. So my topic is new ways into English in the context of declining uptake at A-level and university. And by talking just briefly about this issue of declining uptake at A-level and possible reasons for it and possible things we can do about it, and then give just a few examples of ways we might go about counteracting some of the things that are leading to this decline. So just a few figures to begin with. A-level English entries went down from 83,000 in a date which is now covered by the people on the screen, sorry, in 2013 to 54,000 in 2023. That is a very, very significant decline. I believe that they did actually go up a little bit last year. So that's optimistic, but it's still a massive drop. And there has been a parallel decline in entries for university English. Um, in parallel with this, both at A-level and university, there has been the increased popularity of STEM subjects, but also, interestingly, an increase in what some recent research called the ologies, subjects like sociology, psychology, anthropology, geography, and so on. I mean, I know geography isn't an ology, but you can see the kind of pattern there. And I think that's a very interesting thing for us in English to think about. Um, Quite a lot of research has been done in the last 7 or 8 years on this decline by the British Educational Research Association, by NATE, by the English Association, by the English and Media Centre, and by a number of independent researchers. And these are just three publications which give some detail, which look at in various ways at what is happening with this decline. So to summarize, there are three key issues which have generally been identified in relation to this declining uptake. One was A-level choices from 4 to 3, which happened in 2015, which meant that fewer people took A-level English as a fourth choice in year 12. And the second is the promotion of STEM and in fact the active, deliberate talking down of the arts and humanities by the government not the government, the previous government over the last few years. But the one I want to focus on today is the other issue which has been identified, which is the content and pedagogy associated with the new GCSE English, which began in 2015. So these are some of the key issues that have emerged. In listing these, I don't want to imply that these are happening everywhere all the time, but we do know from both research and anecdotal evidence nationally that these are happening in many places a lot of the time. So one of the issues is the fact that it's become a very high stakes terminal examination associated with high stress school performance pressures, and English in particular, and maths too. It has, as a result, led to a narrowing of both curriculum and pedagogy. It's become more exam focused, more concerned with the kind of English that helps with exams rather than what Barbara Blyman at the English Centre has called picture English. And the way that manifests itself is an overwhelming repetitive focus on micro-analysis of a few literary set texts, almost exclusively in preparation for the exam essay and for and the associated learning of quotes that goes with it. And you won't need me to tell you that the PEE paragraph has become the center of much English around the country and is not popular with many students. At the same time, coursework has been taken much more limited opportunities for varied sorts of extended writing. In fact, for extended writing, all in all, much less in the way of creative original writing and much less in the way of autonomous choice of text and topics by teachers and students, and an associated decreased emphasis on student voice, discussion, and interpretation in the classroom. There's also been a narrowed range of texts with a great emphasis on canonicity and especially 19th century texts, and a bleeding of GCSE style English into Key Stage 3. Barbara Blyman has written a great deal about this, and if you don't know her work, this is her book, What Matters in English Teaching, and I do recommend that you have a look at this for her analysis of what has happened to what she calls big picture English. So we're looking at ways of reframing Key Stage 3 and 4 English to foster student engagement, to broaden the scope of the subject, and to retain critical challenge, also preparing students for exams. This is not easy to do, but we have some examples, and we have 3 examples today, 2 from UK schools, which Kirsten's already mentioned. Phoebe is going to talk about English and climate change, and Matt is going to talk about perspectives on identity through a queer lens. And Stefano Evangelista from the University will also talk about mapping literary Berlin and the use of visual IT aids in bringing a new perspective to English. So to outline these principles, that might help us to address big picture English. What we want to try and do, I think, is to create an ecology of textual variety and intertextuality in the classroom. We want to bring literary, media, non-fiction, and multimodal text together. We need to set all text in a valuable, meaningful relationship with modern texts and issues. And we want to bring diversity into the classroom in relation to things like race, gender, and sexuality. We need to foreground and encourage student response at the heart of what English is about, and multiplicity of interpretation. We know that many students enjoy this and miss it in some of its current manifestations. We need to value student voice and identity, placing discussion at the center of what we do and making connections with students' lives, and foregrounding real-world issues such as gender, race, sexuality, and so on. Lots of other issues, of course. And we want to do more. We want to foreground real-world connections. We want to conduct socio-cultural explanations through English, as well as doing formalist language analysis. We might consider using a thematic curriculum. We might use literary theories to explore the role of literature in the world. We might make use of various manifestations of technology. We might connect literature with the world of film, TV, stage, publishing, and social media. We need to encourage extended writing, much more varied style, coursework style assignments, independent choices, creative and original writing in a range of forms and genres, and writing for real audiences. We need to privilege creativity and enjoyment in learning as much as possible over getting through assessment objectives and rehearsing exam-focused systems. And we need to try and release Key Stage 3 from being explicit preparation for GCSE. There are lots of examples of this in Teaching English, the magazine which I edited until very recently, Nate's magazine. And these are just, I'm very, very quickly going to zoom through a few examples. Here's a great article about a thematic Key Stage 3, which has now been taken over into GCSE at that school. And another article called Hand, Head, Heart and Voice, which is about reclaiming Key Stage 4 English from the GCSE syllabus through thematic approaches. Here are two examples of diversity in action, changing the narrative, new voices, new texts, and new perspectives in the literature classroom. And a really interesting article about how a school in London, Townley Grammar School, decolonized their literature curriculum. And here are two examples of bringing literature and media and computing together. Andrew Byrne at the University of London, working with schools around the country, has done amazing work. For instance, getting kids to work on video games of Macbeth in a way that specifically helps them to analyze the play and understand the issues in the play in a very active, something similar with Beowulf. And finally, graphic novels in the classroom, incorporating coursework into exam-only GCSE English. So these are just a very few ways in which teachers around the country have been working to try and counteract some of the difficulties of the new GCSE. And I want to finish by saying, if you want to know more of these things, please join Nate. And that is it.
That's brilliant, Gary. Thank you. Thank you so much. There's some things there that we will definitely be coming back to in a minute, I'm sure. I think the next speaker, I'm pretty sure, is Phoebe from Cheney School. Phoebe, are you able to join if you're not already? I think I caught a glimpse of you.
Yeah, I'm here. Hi.
Good. Hi.
Let me just share my screen quickly. Hi, everyone. Okay.
Yeah, that looks promising.
Okay.
Fantastic. Yep.
Is that okay?
Yep. Perfect. Yes.
Okay. Great. Hi, everyone. So, as Kirsten kindly introduced me, I'm an English teacher here in Oxford at Cheney School. It's a large comprehensive, it's very diverse with students from a full range of socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds. I'm also a sustainability lead for my multi-academy trust, the River Learning Trust. And I bring together those two roles in my interest in exploring the possibilities that are created when you bring environmental awareness to your English teaching. So what I'm hoping I can do in the next couple of minutes is encourage you to see all the opportunities in taking this approach to your English teaching. I work closely with my colleague Megan Murray-Pepper. I've put my email and her email on this first slide just in case you have any questions or you want to get in touch. And we work with the Oxford Education Deanery to offer teachers at all stages of their careers support with bringing environmental awareness into teaching practice and the school curricula. Before I talk about how that environmental awareness might enrich your English teaching, I first wanted to talk about the role of the English classroom as we educate people through the climate and nature crisis. Information about the climate and nature crisis is all around us. No doubt in the last week you picked up on the fact that this January has been the 18th record-breakingly hot month in the last 19 and no less than 1.75 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And knowing that is one thing, but making sense of it is quite another. The English classroom isn't so much a place where we set out facts, but it is actually a place where we make sense of everything that we encounter using text as our tool to do that. And I think we need to take that role really seriously. As Gary said, we need to think about the relevance of what we're teaching in these unprecedented times, and also a kind of responsibility not to deal in kind of imagined facts as we often do for our English GCSE language paper 2 preparation, but to think about how we construe actual information and to work in collaboration with our colleagues and other subjects, so that essentially we aren't making things up, we're exploring the truth and different ways of looking at it. And that's important because I think the English-based classroom is, you know, it's a place where we have really important discussions, isn't it? We ask big questions about humanity, about, you know, what drives a tyrant, what is love, how do we face our own mortality? And basically we help students think about who they are and how they fit in. And maybe we need to start focusing a bit more on how we fit in, how we all fit together globally, and also, are there some different ways in which we can live? And I think if we apply that question to the literature we study, we can find some really fruitful answers. So I'll just talk briefly about some of the different things that I've done in the curriculum in my school. So the first thing I would say is when you take that environmental awareness as a starting point for choosing text, you can come up with some really interesting possibilities. Texts that give you different perspectives on the world and inevitably bring in some diversity of perspective. So some examples that have worked well in my school. In Year 7, we teach a book called Bone Talk by Candy Gawley, and it's set in the Philippines in 1899 on the eve of the arrival of American colonizers. And as we learn about the culture of the people in that place, we also have this reverse perspective on those colonizers. So we're thinking about their culture and their ways of living, and also offering a slightly more nuanced way of looking at colonization and the power dynamics there. Another text that we've just introduced in Year 9 is one you might have read, Ghost War by Sarah Moss, and that's a brilliant text for exploring differences in the power of knowledge and academic education versus more intuitive knowledge born of experience. It's got interesting ideas about Brexit, about Europe in the 1990s after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and also introduces ideas about the difference between North and South in the UK. Really well received by Year 9, and again thinking much more deeply about connection to place in the contemporary world. You can see there are some more examples of text in there. We also teach Picnic at Hanging Rock. I've not got so long, so I'm just going to quickly summarize. But taking this kind of environmental starting point also can prompt you to look at classics in rich and interesting ways, especially if you go back to them and try and study them with a slightly less anthropocentric view. It's also obviously a great way to approach teaching the Gothic or Romanticism. If, as Gary was also suggesting, you take a more thematic approach to building your curriculum, there's some more opportunities for us in there. So a couple of examples from my school. I developed a different way of teaching about Romanticism by taking a longer view of what literature can teach us about our relationship with the natural world. And that is well received with students who really enjoy taking a philosophical approach and exploring that question in terms of whether a text or an artwork suggests a relationship of mastery, submission, or harmony with the natural world. And it allows you to look at literature or to kind of raise their awareness of longer time frames. So again, very successful in kind of getting them to think critically and analytically. I think I should wrap up so I don't take up too much time from everyone else. But I just got a final slide which kind of summarizes some key things that you might seek to do as you develop that environmental awareness through your English curriculum. So cultivating connection with the natural world. So, you know, there are ample opportunities within text to draw attention to the wildlife, plants and living systems that are inevitably part of those texts, so that they can just be more aware of the world around them, so that they care about it more. Moving deliberately beyond an anthropocentric view of the world is also a really excellent tool for helping them think more carefully about narrative viewpoints in writing. Exploring diverse perspectives in different places and societies. So with environmental awareness comes inclusion and diversity too, and understanding the connections between environmental and social injustice, and looking perhaps more carefully about power dynamics and how they relate to access to land and resources as well. So I'll finish there, but hopefully I've sowed some seeds of ways in which you could take this as a starting point and then unlock some really interesting ideas in your curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Phoebe. That's brilliant. I mean, I'll often try to encourage students to think across periods in terms of that, where are the seeds of social injustice, for example, and it's not some divide between our own concerns and the earlier literature that can seem difficult to access, perhaps because of the language barrier sometimes, but it's there. And it's really nice to hear you talk about that. And I'm sure we'll come back to that. So thank you. And so much food for thought there about how to incorporate these things into the teaching. Can we hear next from Matt? That would be brilliant if you,
yeah, of course, I'll just
jump on.
share my screen.
Thank you.
Can you see it now? Yeah. And then,
yep, that's great. Lovely. That looks great.
Cool.
Yeah.
So, as Kirsten's already said, I'm Matt Simpson and I'm an English teacher at a state-maintained school just outside of Bristol. I'm going to be talking to you today about what I sort of broadly term queering the English classroom and how it can shape a new pedagogical approach to teaching English. So I trained to be a teacher in the wake of the 2017 school report from Stonewall, which outlined the bleak reality that many LGBTQIA+ students still face, sadly, in English schools. And this, combined with many of the frustrations that Gary so eloquently outlined in his first talk, made me think about how I could challenge this to make my classroom a more inclusive place and actually try and dismantle with the students some of those ideologies that sadly still perpetuate in schools. So I went back to the work on queer theory and queer literature that I'd studied whilst at university and began to think about how a theoretical perspective based on queer theory could be applied to the English curriculum. In the broader sense, queerness and queer theory is the belief, it's anti-assimilationist, it's the belief that divergent sexualities should be not only celebrated, but used to challenge those ideologies that I've already mentioned, to actually shine a light on the injustices at the heart of them and not be tried to assimilate within them. I outlined three key aspects of queer theory that could be incorporated into English pedagogy. They were a sense of becoming, critical multiculturalism, and the uncanny. And I'm going to go through on the next few slides how I've incorporated those into my practice and also outline what each one is. I initially focused on a Key Stage 3 scheme of work on autobiography, which was the basis of my master's thesis. But since then, I've been trying to apply it across Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 5, and I'll try and give as many concrete examples as I can. So starting with this sense of becoming, which is really the belief that identity is not fixed. Identity is fluid and ephemeral, and it is continually constructed and reconstructed by our interactions with ourselves in self-reflection, but with those around us and the world around us. I think in terms of how we can foster this in the classroom, in my initial scheme of work that I mentioned earlier, I really tried to focus on autofiction, autobiography that challenges fixed identities. So where writers are consciously and deliberately sort of crafting their own identities through writing. And I've shared some of the examples there that I've used in the scheme of work there with the students. But also what is essential, and kind of again what Gary touched upon earlier, was allowing opportunities for students to write their own autobiography and really encouraging them to see this as an act of creation, of creating their own identity and not trying to present themselves as any fixed state of being. At Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5, this obviously becomes more difficult with the set curriculum, but I think actually we can still augment this by really focusing on characters whose identity fluctuates throughout the text. And there are so many examples in literature, but from the most common set text, we can think of Sheila in Spectacles, and obviously Shakespeare. There are endless examples of this, but you've got Lady Macbeth in Macbeth, and Ariel in The Tempest as two of the most notable examples. Then we come on to critical multiculturalism. This is really giving students a lens to view text, but also the wider world, to view those interlocking systems of power that exist within society, whether that be sexuality, gender, race, or many more. Again, the common theme running through in all these talks. One of the best things we can do here is really think about text choice at Key Stage 3 and strive for texts that are non-essentialist, non-heteronormative, non-homonormative. And some texts that I've studied and got schemes of work for are The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta and Refugee Boy by Benjamin Zephaniah, and teaching those to the younger years. I also think, and again, Gary touched upon literary theory, introducing this at Key Stage 3 in sort of bite-sized format, admittedly, but trying to like demystify literary theory and giving it to students when they are young and encouraging them to apply it to non-canonical texts and popular culture. You can see my probably somewhat flawed example of trying to apply it to Finding Nemo on this slide as an example for them, and then encouraging them to go off and apply it to different items from popular culture. At Key Stage 4, I think this multicultural lens can be really useful for students to engage with both language papers, but particularly the non-fiction one, because it can really encourage them to see many of the inherent biases and prejudices that exist within those non-fiction texts and make that a part of their analysis. And then obviously when we get to Key Stage 5, it becomes a lot more straightforward because students actively have to include critical theories in their writing in preparation for university and beyond. And so you can explicitly teach queer theory through the work of Michael Warner, Jack Halberstam, and of course Judith Butler as well. And the final one, and probably the hardest to define, is this sense of the uncanny stemming from Freud's original essay with the same name. And it's trying to find those moments that are both familiar and unfamiliar, where we feel disconcerted, when we feel unsettled as a result. And I think, this is probably why many of us became English teachers, English professors, because we found those moments in literature where we felt uncomfortable. And as a result, we really threw into question everything, and that we continually still strive. That's why we keep reading, looking for those moments. obviously with a class full of 30 students, no one text is ever going to create that unanimous moment for all students in there because they have their own backgrounds, they have their own context. But I think this is just really, by challenging sort of the existing state and trying to expose them to a wide variety of texts in a wide variety of contexts, we can try and encourage students and allowing them to self-reflect on these moments, to find their own moments like this within literature, and then hopefully that will encourage them on to go on and find more. And indeed, on this slide, I've included different examples of student work where I've allowed them to reflect either through creative writing or through reflection on different texts that we've studied that really have stood out to me over my teaching career, where they have had that unsettling moment and they've really discovered what literature is for them, I believe. This was a whistle-stop tour on sort of how I've tried to queer the English curriculum, but another shameless plug for Nate. I have written about it more extensively in Teaching English, so that article is available, and also my master's, so I would be more than happy to share that with anyone. I would also always love to hear any examples from other teachers who've experimented with something similar in their own classroom, so please do reach out. That's you, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. That's absolutely brilliant. This has been so rich, and we'll leap ahead right now to Professor Stefano Evangelista. If you can jump on, Stefano.
Yes, thank you very much, Kirsten. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Yeah. Can you all see the screen?
Yeah. Yes, yes.
Cool. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for inviting me, first of all. So today I'm going to introduce to you very briefly this project on which I've been working now for a few years together with my colleague Gesa Stedman, who is the director of the Center for British Study at the Humboldt University in Berlin. So what you see here is a website called Happy in Berlin, Berlin through the eyes of English writers, or Berlin through English eyes, which is the result of this collaboration, which also resulted in an exhibition in 2021 on British writers in Berlin, which was shown here in Oxford and in Berlin and in several publications. We're focusing on the early 20th century, so writers who from Britain traveled to Berlin in the early 20th century and wrote about their experiences there, not necessarily in book forms, but also in letters and other more ephemeral types of literature. As we all know, what also happened in 2021 was that we were in the thick of the pandemic. So the website is very much the result of the fact that Gesa and I worried about the fact that the exhibition might not actually take place. So we decided to build a website to kind of almost replace the exhibition in case it couldn't happen. But it then turned out to be a really useful and interesting medium to work on in its own right. And what we've tried to do is we're trying to develop something that could be a reliable tool for general readers, not for academic readers who want to know about this period, who want to know about these writers, but also for schools. And so we've also included some teaching resources in the website in collaboration with the Stewart Spender Trust, which I'm sure some of you will know. And I'll come back to the resources in a moment. So if we scroll down a little bit, you can see here what the exhibition in Berlin looked like. So the main feature of the website is writers. So here are the writers, and I should say, first of all, that the website is very much still growing, right? So these are the writers that we have kind of explored so far, and you can click on each one of them. The links take you to a picture and then to a short narrative about them. We've tried to, as we selected these writers, we tried to mix canonical with less canonical authors, but of course we've also kept an eye to diversity, trying to include especially women and queer authors where we could. So if we, for example, click on the most famous one of them, I suppose Christopher Isherwood, who wrote extensively about Berlin, what you get when you click on an author is you get a little blurb and then an image and then a narrative that we have written about their biographical, as it were, historical experiences in Berlin, why they went there, where they went, what they did, and also what they wrote. And scrolling down a little bit, a short bibliography with other resources, again, aimed very much at not too specialized, as it were, academic readers, so a mixture of biography, sometimes even links to newspaper articles and other online resources where applicable. If we scroll even further down, you see that there are links to other writers or places. I'll come back to places in the website that are relevant to Isherwood. The text allows you also to link through to other writers, as I said, and indeed places that are relevant to every particular writer. So, for example, in the case of Isherwood, if we click on the Institute of Sexual Science, which is a place that Isherwood kind of spent time with when he was in Berlin, you also get a mini, as it were, biography of the place, again with a picture. We try to use pictures from the time whenever possible and explaining to you what it was. So this Institute of Sexual Science, for example, was a very important Berlin institution from the early 20th century, which was a kind of cultural hub for queer people in Berlin. It was also a place where, for example, sex workers or transgender people could get legal advice, but it was also a place that was actually visited by many writers, because it had a museum about sexual science, and Isherwood himself ended up living there for several months because the institute also had flats that it rented out. The most important thing here is that each of these places on the website also has a little kind of as links to teaching resources. These are the sheets for use in the classroom that we've developed together with the Stephen Spender Trust. And most of the places have links to specific resources designed for A-level students in English and A-level students in German. So if we try and click on this one in the students in the English classroom, you have again a mini narrative about the Institute of Sexual Science, picture, and then scrolling down, in this particular case, we have a quotation from Isherwood's own autobiography, where he describes the Institute of Sexual Science, and then some questions for use in the classroom about this particular passage, and asking to extract information from the passage, and encouraging students to kind of link to broader issues. Right. So let me just go back here. Another way of using the website is by clicking on Map. So what we have here is a map of 1931 Berlin with a series of locations that, again, you can click on, locations that we've selected because they kind of turned out to be particularly important and kind of as literary hubs. So these are not kind of places. So the institute, for example, is up here, 03, places where writers met, places where places that writers wrote about, places that were particularly relevant, let's say, for this literary culture of expatriate British writers in Berlin. So if we click, for example, briefly on number 14, this is the UFA Pavilion. So it's a cinema. So it turns out that Berlin was basically the world capital of cinema in the early 20th century, and lots of writers, English writers who went there, went to the cinema, wrote about the cinema. And so if you, again, click on another one, you will see, for example, all sorts of people like Isherwood, like Stephen Spender, but also Virginia Woolf, for example, went to the cinema in Berlin and wrote in her letters about what it was like to be in cinemas in Berlin. Berlin was full of very kind of futuristic cinemas and very glitzy cinemas at the time that people were particularly kind of impressed by. And again, you will see teaching resources for English and for German. Okay, so what we were trying to do with the website is to offer a digital tool for the study of English literature through visualization, hopefully attractively so. We've tried to use lots of the period photographs. For instance, I have to say that we used a professional museum designer, so the website actually looks particularly good from your phone. So in case you allow the students to use that in the classroom, that would be a good way to access the website. We wanted to think about how English literature exists beyond the book and beyond the more canonical forms of the novel and the poem. So thinking about cinema, for example, thinking about travel. There are quotations from travel guides, for example. Here, the very title, Happy in Berlin, comes from a guidebook, an informal guidebook to Berlin, called How to Be Happy in Berlin, published in 1929. We wanted to take kind of viewers to places like underground gay bars, cabarets, etc. And finally, we also obviously wanted to open up English and put it in dialogue with other disciplines, German and history in this particular case, I suppose trying to go towards what Gary was talking about as a big picture English in his presentation at the start of the panel. One last quick thing is that on the website here, you can see that you can click on teaching resources, and this takes you to a website which is especially for designed for teachers and students, which tells you how to use the resources and how to use the website, as it were. So this is all for me, and I'll be really delighted for any feedback, either now or if you ever use the website to get it back.
The share screen button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. But in the meantime, I thought maybe I would get things started by going back to Gary. I was really struck by how you sort of started us off thinking about three things in particular that you had put on the slide, and I hope I got these right. Correct me if I'm wrong. But one point you made was about creating an ecology of textual variety and intertextuality.
Yeah.
And then thinking about real world connections. And then finally, these are just some of the things, you had many others, but diversity in action. And I was thinking about just after the final panelists, looking back, how much all of the talks spoke in one way or another to those points. And I was wondering if you could reflect on that.
Yes. I mean, I think it was just interesting to so the 3 points you made again were diversity, the ecology of intertextuality, and
yes, textual variety.
Textuality, yeah.
But also that idea of an ecology, because all of these ideas that we've been this really mind expanding about what English even is.
Yeah,
and
that's
how
right.
that's
yeah. I mean, I think
I
what
was
all
curious
these
about your thoughts.
what all these talks really have had in common is first of all an emphasis on this idea of big picture English, which privileges the connections between students and students' worlds and the text that they're studying. And perhaps controversially, I might say that in some respects, this is in conflict with some rather reductive ideas about knowledge-rich curriculum, which tend to take knowledge as the center of everything and expect students to adjust to that knowledge, whether they feel it's relevant to their lives or their worlds or not. Knowledge, of course, is vital, and I would never be against the idea of a knowledge-rich curriculum. But I think the way it's sometimes presented is unyielding. What we've seen today is examples where we are encouraging students to connect in meaningful ways with the literature that they're studying by bringing a thematic approach, as many of these have done, or by connecting it with real world geographically or culturally or politically, or by connecting it with students' sense of their own identity and their own creativity and their own agency in things, or a mixture of those things. And I think that the way we treat set texts is often unhelpful. They're monumental. They're they're on a pedestal. What we need is what I call an ecology of textuality, and intertextuality in the classroom, where texts are brought into relationship with each other, different periods are brought into relationship with each other, different genres and types of literature. I mean, you know, I've always thought that a great scheme of work would be, you know, quest literature or fantasy literature, from, you know, the Icelandic sagas and Beowulf to yeah, Harry Potter and Philip Pullman and so on. What you know, what old text can be made much more meaningful by bringing the relationship with new ones in exciting ways. So I don't, and diversity is at the heart of all of this, really. It's the diversity not just in terms of the narrow vision of diversity as being about race, but diversity of all kinds in the classroom.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I frequently will hear from students, especially because I see them at right from the beginning, first years, and there's a sense of what's in the text. You know, well, what is in this text? And it's kind of about getting a can opener and opening it. And actually, that's fine. But it's also about what fascinates me with these panel talks is partly how much we can challenge that idea and reframe even in the slightest way. It doesn't take a lot to just go, actually, let's think just slightly differently about what might be in this text and how you can see things that you might never have seen, but just with the slightest change of perspective. So if we think about Phoebe's approach with climate, you might not actually even think of climate as something in Beowulf or any, you know, George Eliot or another text that you encounter, let's say, in first year English here at Oxford. And yet, I would love to know Phoebe's thoughts on this, but my impression from your talk is that it wouldn't take too much to get students to think in that way, that climate is there. Oops, we've got some noise. Sorry, Phoebe. Oh, do you want to try talk? Okay. There's a kind of white noise. Not sure what to do about that.
Yeah, we can't hear you at all.
Yeah. Oh, that's too bad. It was kind of like just coming across like.
Yeah, that's
better?
good.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yes.
Oh, okay, right. So I was saying that that I think you know, in A level, in some ways I think kind of inappropriately we bring in critical theories in a way that is you know, in a kind of university style, but actually simplified versions of those critical theories really enliven the classroom, Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. And I think they're really important for allowing them to see not just that there are, you know, these texts that everybody should know, and a kind of a sense of, you know, kind of proving something by understanding difficult texts, but much more, you know, how can this text help you to reflect on what you can see in the world around you? And, you know, and I think I like what Gary says about that ecology of different texts. We know that, you know, you visit an idea early on, and it might be the description of landscape or the availability of resources in a text that you're looking at in year 7, and then you come back to it again in a completely different text in later years, and it becomes richer every time. So I think that, you know, overlaying some kind of fundamental questions about how we interact with the landscapes we subsist in, and allocation of resources and all those things are always going to be relevant to any given text. And if they're missing, then that's a question in itself.
Yeah, and actually we've now got a question here that both Phoebe and Matt, it's addressed to both of you. Maybe we could get Matt first on this and then Phoebe. I'm just going in order because there's no hand raising function and it can be confusing. Have Phoebe and Matt found success in working with other departments at their schools, or do they have plans to? I'm thinking about making connections with, say, the art department or the science and history departments. And so that's the question I wonder if maybe Matt could start with.
So my whole project was actually inspired by the art classroom. Academic at Cambridge University, Tabitha Millett, wrote an article called Queering the Art Classroom, where she sort of explored how it could be done with art. And she gave a talk on it when I was doing my PhD. And that was actually what sparked the idea for me of like, oh, this could be applied to it as well. So I'd really recommend reading her work, because there's been far more extensive work on queering the art classroom than there has the English classroom so far. I also, at my previous school in Cambridge, there was a really interesting thing published by Dr. Hester at Cambridge University about queer histories in Cambridge, not dissimilar from sort of the sort of thing that Stefano really nicely outlined as well. And we did some work with the history department there, and obviously from the literature, sort of outlining the queer histories of Cambridge. And obviously because it was the place that they lived in as well, that was really fruitful and really beneficial, because they, again, we're talking about those, the ecology of context and stuff like that. They could see it, they could recognize places that they probably walked past and had no idea. So I think it's a really fruitful opportunity to work with as many different departments as possible, and that cross-curricular learning is always really beneficial for students.
Brilliant. And actually, I also want to ask another related question of both you and Phoebe, which is, how have students responded to your attempts to have these different approaches, these different ways into literature? Do you want to start, Matt?
Sure. Sorry, I was going to wait for Phoebe. I think on the whole, particularly when they're younger, they're so willing and open to learn. And I tend not to be too explicit about it, because I think that can almost, you're almost warning them about it. But if you just integrate it into your teaching practice, one, they become used to it, but also they are so willing to think in new and different ways. Like I said, that example I gave of introducing literary theory at Key Stage 3, I think those are some of the most fun lessons I've had in my career, because they were all applying it to everything around them. And if you go in being like, there's this big scary thing that you do at university, and some people don't think it should exist at all, you set them up to fail. Whereas if you just go like, here are some fun things, can we apply it to this, can we apply it to this, immediately they absolutely loved it.
Yeah, so I mean, to the first question about cross-curricular work, I mean, certainly we cross-reference, I guess. So, if we're talking about the Romantics and abolition of the slave trade, or what, anything like that, we try and make sure that we know when they've covered those topics in history, so that we can kind of reinforce the knowledge that is there. I think occasionally we do things like have a kind of whole school themed curriculum week, where you might have one lesson, for example, that might relate to politics and climate, for example, or biodiversity. Art's actually one of the subject areas which I think kind of most closely mirrors what we do in English, in terms of really thought-provoking topics around what balance is, for example, and bringing a kind of environmental angle to that question. I think the text that I mentioned that we've been teaching recently have had a really positive response from students in class. Started teaching Ghost Wall last year, and the kind of some of the ideas that brought up, and some of the insights into the kind of inequalities around this country, really fired up their imaginations. And when it comes to that's kind of very embedded in a northeast, the landscape in the northeast of England, so it's kind of set in moorland, and learning about all their kind of, the story is that they're reenacting kind of Stone Age settlement as part of a university undergraduate course in anthropology. But there's a girl who's come along because her dad's an enthusiast and he's not academic, so she's kind of there slightly against her will. So it's a coming of age story. But the things that it brings up, like just the plants that you can eat, like bilberries and blackberries, and how you find shade and how you make sure water is clear, and all of those things they love talking about. And in a diverse classroom, when you're talking about where your food comes from, actually that brings in a lot of students who can kind of speak to their own individual experience in lots of different places, their connections to farming down generations. All of those things immediately become much more relevant, and they're really, they bring students together in the classroom in quite an exciting way.
That's brilliant. Yeah, that's fantastic. And Stefano, I was wondering if you could just say a bit about going back to Gary's point at the start about intertextuality and variety, and the way in which your website sort of gently presses against these boundaries we often set up about how you can encounter English literature. Here we have it in Berlin and many different disciplines interacting, and there's just this network feel to it. I wondered if that was what was behind it, an idea about actor network or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it is very much what is behind it. It's in many ways a product of the fact that a lot of the people who actually went to Berlin at this time, they didn't actually write literary texts about them. So it was almost a necessity that we found ourselves including things which are not standard literary texts. But then we immediately understood that that could actually be used in kind of turned into a strength, right? To make us think, what constitutes literature and what constitutes a literary text and how literary texts circulate. Also, the fact of trying to put them on a map, is very powerful, I think, for people who might know what the city looks like, etc. But in general, I think it's really useful to try and think of how literature kind of happens in space, right, rather than simply on the page, and how we can break down the texts to kind of imagine them as networks, as connections, right, between an author and another, rather than the property of one particular author, or as being as much a product of a particular place, say a kind of cinema or a bar that they visited or that they might have been writing from, right? Because very often we have people who write, say, a letter from a specific location, and we kind of pin down the location where it is. Again, to try and suggest that, in a way, the place is as much the author, as it were, of that particular text as the actual author. And so I suppose then you could link to some of the discussions about theory that you were having just before, to make students think about, for example, what is an author, right? And stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. And it really does sort of demystify perhaps this idea of the text with a capital T, and make it much more about daily living and just how we all interact and what kinds of things we encounter and how those things get recorded and become text. And I think that is so liberating for a lot of students who otherwise might sort of see the text as sort of daunting, very book-based things, sort of anchored to a place.
Yeah, indeed. And going back to some of the things that Matt was saying, so we workshopped this a couple of times in schools in Berlin. So these students who were studying English literature there. And we found that one of the stories, as it were, that interested them most was the whole LGBTQ plus kind of content of the website. And they were very thrilled to discover this going on 100 years before. So they were really interested in linking, their own kind of experience, for example, of how these communities kind of inhabit urban spaces nowadays, to what was going on in the past, and there's also, of course, the legal history here, whether kind of the fact that homosexuality was not legal in Britain, whereas the German legislation was much more liberal. So the kind of these writers kind of traveled to kind of build communities in that way, etc. So there's a kind of really interesting overlap there, again, with history.
That's brilliant. And amazingly, now we're at 3 o'clock. I don't know where the time went, but we will probably just have to draw it to a close and say a huge thank you to Stefano and Matt and Phoebe and Gary for this panel. It's been so rich and all too fast.